Thank you. Thanks for this honor. Thanks for keeping the introduction mercifully short, because in India the tradition is to give long introductions. I'm grateful that you kept it very short. And the operational line in that introduction is political activist. That's what I am. I'm no longer a scholar. I'm certainly not an academic. I used to be one, and I'm happy to be a political activist, which is the vantage point from which I wish to speak today. I'm particularly happy that I'm back in an institution where I studied. 1981-83, I was a student, like many of you, of Center for Political Studies. I did my master's from here. I must confess that for nearly 2.5 decades, almost for 3 decades, I was somewhat indifferent to my JNU legacy and was awkward, if not embarrassed, about my JNU connections, till the assault on JNU began a few years ago. And I'm very happy to say that once that assault on JNU began, intellectual assault, political assault, and the physical assault on JNU, I rediscovered my attachment with JNU and almost began to feel proud of being a JNUite, a word that I had never used in my life before. Therefore, I'm very happy to be here. I'm very proud that students have started this lecture series, not the universities, not the authorities. Not that I have anything against the authorities in this context, but because JNU has had the tradition of student-led initiatives. The Election Commission of JNU was not formed by any by any authority. Students would create their own election commission, which would hold elections. Students decided who to invite, who not to invite to speak. The post-dinner talks, which have sadly become rare or almost non-existent. I'm so happy that you are reclaiming that space of student-led discussions, debates which are open. And therefore, I must compliment all of you who've been behind this initiative. As many of you are from CPS, I cannot but recall some of my teachers who are no more. Many of you may not have heard about them: Professor Rashiduddin Khan, Professor C.P. Bhambri, Professor Imtiaz Ahmed, Professor Kiran Saxena. They are no more in this world. But today when I speak, I must remember them and what I learned from them. I should also begin by recalling some of my teachers. I won't bore you with the entire list of all the teachers, but some who were directly involved in imparting me thinking about political theory, what I wish to speak today. Specifically Professor Sudipta Kaviraj and Professor Rajiv Bhargav, who are not in this room but very much around to guide us, who really taught me how to think. And even today, I feel grateful for what I learned. I may disagree with some of what they have said. I may criticize them, but I cannot but recall how much their thinking has shaped the way I think today. Without any more prefatory remarks, I'll straight come to the topic of what I've chosen to speak today. And I must also thank the organizers once again for allowing me to speak on what I wanted to speak rather than what they wanted me to speak on, which is a call for an Indian political theory. Now, the very title itself implies 5 propositions. Number 1, that there is something called Indian political theory. Otherwise, why would there be a call? Number 2, that this is not just a description, it is something desirable. Otherwise, why would you give a call? That number 3, that this does not exist right now. at least not in the way that it should. If it existed, there's no need to give a call for something that already exists. Number 4, that this is realizable, that there is a way of moving towards it. You don't give call for impossible things. And finally, that this must be our collective priority. Hence the call, there's sense of urgency, priority about it. All this is, in a sense, written into the subject itself. That's what I'm going to do this afternoon. I'll break what I'm going to say in exactly these 5 parts. Part 1, what is Indian political theory? I'll begin by saying what it is not, distinguish it from many namesakes, and what qualifies to be an Indian political theory. I'm not going to give a very heavy, complex, or unique definition. I want to work with common sense. In part 2, then, I'll transit to why do we need an Indian political theory? Begin by saying something about why do we need theory at all? And why do we need a theory with an Indian suffix? Part 3, I will get into, do we already have a body of thought that can be called Indian political theory? In large measure, if not entirely. Does it already exist? My disquiet with what passes for political theory in the Indian academia is what I would focus on and offer something about what would constitute political theory, Indian political theory in the sense in which I call it. In part 4, I'll say something about what is the way forward. I don't want to give just a vague, abstract call. I want to break it down into smaller bits of doables. How do we go about creating Indian political theory? I'll give some concrete proposals about reorienting the discipline, the curricula, and the research about our priorities. And I'll conclude by saying something about why this is such an urgent task in the face of the dismantling of our republic today. That's the political bit, but I'll keep that political bit towards the end. But before I get into part 1, let me begin by clarifying that I'm not a political theorist. I don't pretend to be one. Yes, when I was a student of CPS, I did think of myself as a political theorist, was trained into one, and for the first almost 10 years of my academic career, I practiced what is recognized as political theory, namely to write about philosophy of social science. My first paper was on positivism and hermeneutics. Another one was on Marcuse, Coletti. Was interested then in Quentin Skinner, in theories of interpretation. Foucault and Derrida had just arrived on the Indian academic scene. Gramsci was the real passion. And I made myself believe that I was doing political theory, partly because it was the done thing. You know, so many of us do things because it's the done thing, because everyone else is doing this. And especially in the CPS, somehow the assumption was that if you had good grades, then you did political theory. My friend Gopal Guru once called it the theoretical Brahmins and the empirical Shudras. That, I think, was largely true, at least in those days. If you were smart, you did political theory. And if you had nothing else to do, you did public administration and international relations. I do not for a minute agree with that. I'm just describing what was the common understanding at that time and why people like me just sort of drifted towards doing what we considered was political theory. This is when 1989 happened. The Rath Yatra, then came Mandal, Market, Indian politics, and indeed the world politics. USSR collapsed. Everything was changing. And I asked myself, how do I make sense of the changes that I see around myself? And frankly, I did not find my political theory being of much help. So, much to the astonishment and disappointment of many of my professional colleagues, who still remind me when they meet me after 40 years, अरे तुम इतना अच्छे political theory करते थे, छोड़ के क्या election studies शुरू कर दिया तुमने? So I left that and I started trying to make sense of Indian politics, which led me to election studies and so on. I'm saying all this just to underline two things. Number one, I'm not a political theorist. I'm basically a consumer of political theory. And I speak here just as a consumer, someone who reads these things, someone who needs it, and someone who can express disquiet. Just as you can express disquiet with a phone, just as you can express unhappiness with a software that you are using, you don't have to be a software engineer in order to say something is wrong with that software. It doesn't work. It doesn't do what I expect it to do. So I speak from a similar status, not as a political theorist. I don't speak as an insider. At best, an informed consumer. And secondly, I say all this to underline the fact that this is not meant to be a critique of my colleagues who do political theory. It is as much a self-critique as it is a critique of others. It is as much a critique of my own academic career when I was doing study of Indian politics, not merely when I was formally a political theorist, but also when I was doing election studies, when I was doing research, survey methods, and so on. Much of the critique that I'm going to offer applies to me equally as it does to others. So it's not just a critique directed at others, it's as much a self-critique. With this preface, let me start with part one of what is Indian political theory. I will deliberately, as I said, I'm a consumer, so I have very little interest in the scholarly debates about political theory versus political thought versus political philosophy versus political ideology. These may be relevant distinctions. I do not know, and frankly, I do not care. For me, the important thing is simply answering three questions. For me, the enterprise of political theory is about answering three questions for me. Number one, where do we stand today? Number two, where do we want to go? Number three, how do we go from where we are to where we wish to go? Simple. That would be my enterprise today. So much of discussion on political theory hangs so much up in the air, and we are so terrified by it all the time. Political theory is almost another name for intellectual atyachar that happens all over. That my attempt would be to bring it down, closer to who we are, closer to what we do in our lives and so on. As I said, I'm a consumer. So, what they do, हलवाई की दुकान के पीछे वो क्या करते हैं मुझे इंटरेस्ट नहीं है. मुझे तो सिर्फ खाना और बताना नहीं, मज़ा नहीं आया, ठीक नहीं है, बस. आपके बाकी डिस्टिंक्शंस होंगे, आप देख लीजिएगा. So I'm interested in these three things. What do these three things involve? Where do we stand today is a question of explanatory and causal political theory. This is about establishing cause-effect relations. This is about understanding the big picture. This is about a certain condensing of our political experience. Where do we want to go is a normative political theory. What is good, what is worth doing, what should we, what kind of an ideal society should we be moving towards? That's your entire political philosophy that Rajiv Bhargav specializes in. Third is, how do we go from where we are? That's the prescriptive part, a part that we've almost forgotten. We don't even think this is what political theorists should do. Now, for me, Indian political theory is simply answering these three questions for contemporary India. Any attempt to answer these three in today's context for contemporary Indian politics would count for Indian political theory. No more, no less. No need for mystique, no need for fetishization. Going by this very elementary definition, later on I'll keep adding a few things to it. Going by this elementary definition, what political theory is not, Indian political theory is not. Political theory done by an Indian is not necessarily Indian political theory. Because so much of what people of Indian origin in India or abroad do in political theory, there's very little Indian content to it. So it's not dependent on who does it. Equally, political theory done in India or in Indian institutions is not necessarily Indian political theory. We should be clear about it. The political theory that is practiced in an Indian institution, that could be JNU, that could be DU, that could be wherever, that does not by itself become an Indian political theory. Western political thought applied to India does not become Indian political theory. An Indian political theory has to make sense of India, make sense of the Indian experience, make sense of what we face today. Its origins are hardly of any consequence. The person could be sitting in New York and doing Indian political theory. Someone could be sitting in Delhi and doing political theory that has nothing to do with India. I will spell out a little more of what it means to do Indian political theory, but not right now. Right now, I'll start with something as elementary as that, and move on to the second question of why do we need Indian political theory? I must confess that I had, in my intellectual journey, reached a stage when I had almost switched off from political theory or from theorization altogether. Because so much of what passed for theorization looked like just jumble of words which had no meaning, which had no power, which had no explanatory significance for me. But that was clearly an overreaction to the fetishization of theory that goes along. But theory is something. But we do need theory. So when I say I'm a political activist, this is not to deride theory. This is not to say, well, we can do without theory. Let's do practice. There is no point of theory. No, that's simple nonsense. Because every practice has an unstated or stated theory built into it. You may be able to articulate it. You may not be able to articulate it. But there is a theory that informs any practice. So theory is important. And theory is something that all of us do all the time in more or less conscious, more or less systematic, or more or less successful ways. All of us are engaging in that exercise. So, I'm a woman. I experience strange behavior from men. I experience things that I don't like. I find some men who are otherwise, in my family, my father, my brother, who are otherwise very nice human beings, doing things that I feel uneasy about. Then I come across this word called patriarchy. Suddenly things fall in place. I can connect so many things. I can make sense of it. I can understand that men need not be villains in order to do things which are obnoxious. So this one word, this one bit of theory begins to give sense, make sense of so much of my lived reality. Yadavs of Haryana, where I come from, I used to wonder, why is it that my Nani and my Dadi had Kaur in their name? Anar Kaur and Prakash Kaur was the name. I could never relate. We are not Sikhs. Why this Kaur is there in their names? And why everyone carries a Singh in their name, in the generation of my father. And when people said, you are an OBC, I said, yes, but no, I don't know. There's something different. It's not quite an OBC, not quite a backward caste. And when I came to JNU, and when I encountered Bihar for the first time in JNU, many of my friends said, "Tum Yadav ho?" I would say, yes. वही जिसे हम अहीर कहते हैं. हाँ, बड़े शरीफ हो. They couldn't relate this. They found it very odd to, they probably expected me to carry a lathi or something in JNU or something. Till I encountered this word, Sanskritization. Sanskritization, the theory, suddenly made sense of so much of my experience. And then I discovered that actually the original research article of Sanskritization was written on Yadavs of South Haryana. This is what a theory does. A theory suddenly enables you to put so much of your discrete experience, discrete, contradictory, scattered experience into a whole, something you suddenly begin to make sense of. That's why we need theory. This is the power of theory. It's like getting a map of the city or the town or the village that you've always lived in. Try doing that. Try searching your village on a Google map. Suddenly you get a different experience. Acha, this is so small. I always thought this is bigger. Acha, this distance is not too much. In my childhood, the school that I went to, which looked so distant because I would cycle to that school. Then I Googled my town and I looked at the map and I said, oh my God, it's 1.2 kilometers. I thought it was a huge distance. So theory is a window. Theory is a map. Theory is something that condenses our experience. Theory is something that enables us to see, to say, to do things that we would otherwise not be able to see, say, or do. Please also remember, never forget that while theory enables us to see things, a theory always makes us unsee things. The best of theory, it suddenly says, of all this experience that you have, this bit is important, this is unimportant, don't pay too much attention to it, this is a distraction, this is a minor thing. Theory, so part of the process of being able to see is the process of unseeing. So for years, for decades, a certain kind of Marxist theory would not allow Marxist scholars to see something that they experienced on a daily basis in their life, namely caste. This is something they encountered every single day. And yet the theory made them unsee that part. So that's the danger of theory. It is so powerful. It makes us see things which we could not see otherwise, it makes us unsee things that may be right in front of our eyes. Now, mark of a good theory to my mind is its ability to provide us understanding. A good theory is like a good piece of poetry. You read it and you say, that's what I wanted to say. Mere dil mein tha par pata nahi, I didn't have the words. This man has the words. But it was there. A good theory enables you to make sense of the world that you are moving in. It gives you a sense of direction. It provides you with a certain ease in your practice. Please remember, theory is no guarantee of good practice. That's not what theory is meant to do. But when you fail, a good theory can tell you why you failed. It is no guarantee. So the crude idea that a good theory would lead to good practice, that's not always the case. And we should not burden a theory with doing those kind of stuff. But clarifying is that principal job of theory. And the trouble, as I said, it can make us unsee things. And I always use the example of, because we are in JNU, so we go to Munirka. There are three things we can do if we are walking in Munirka. One is to walk in Munirka without a map, which is all right. We do it all the time. We sort of find our way. We make a few mistakes. We get it. Second would be a lovely thing when we walk in Munirka with a map of Munirka. We would be faster, smarter, and so on. But imagine a third thing. Walking in Munirka with a map of Manhattan, New York, and trying to identify buildings. What does that do to you? It's not as ridiculous as you think it is. I mean, it is ridiculous, but it's not as uncommon as you think it is. I would like to insinuate that so much of what passes for political theory is actually that. Trying to walk in Munirka with a map of Manhattan. And that's why a bad theory, an inappropriate theory, can leave us in a situation worse than walking without a map. You would be much better off without a map. Because a theory can confuse, can misdirect, can mislead. That's what brings me to my point. Why do we need political theory with an Indian suffix? Simply because political theory is always contextual. I'm almost tempted to say there is nothing called the political theory. Because what is called political theory has written in invisible parenthesis, West is written in that. What is called social, it applies to social theory as well. And we forget to use the word West, which is inscribed in an invisible ink. Now, so when I say that we need Indian political theory, and when I insist on that Indian suffix, it is not because I believe that there is something unique about India or we are Vishwagurus. Indian political theory should then tell Nigerians about how to lead their life, tell Indonesians or tell Afghans. No, I have no such strange ideas in my mind. And not just because we are 1/6 of humanity. That by itself doesn't give us a title to reach the remaining 5/6. I insist on this Indian suffix because our journey is unique. Which is not to say that other journeys are not unique. If I was standing in Pakistan today, I would have probably said the same things. If I was standing in Brazil today, I would have probably said the same things. We are not reliving the past or present of Europe. We are on a unique path. The Indian case is even more exceptional. The case of Indian democracy, the case of Indian politics, is even more exceptional than the usual cases of everyone is unique, but we are unique in a unique way, to put it differently. Because Indian democracy succeeded when global theory told us it will not succeed. And it collapsed when no theory told us that it might collapse. So just for this reason, we appear to be rather unique. Now, when I say unique, I do not mean to say that that our uniqueness lies in our past only. Because often we can misunderstand our uniqueness, especially in the present political dispensation. Every uniqueness is understood in terms of in terms of glory, in terms of being higher than others. I have no such thing in mind. I do not mean for a minute to deny that a substantial part of our political experience today is drawn from institutions and practices that originated in Europe and America. That our constitution and many of our practices, things like political parties, so much of our constitutional structure, which is straight away taken from a European experience. We are not reliving the experience of Chandragupta Maurya or Akbar for that matter. So I do not mean to deny for a moment the modernity of our experience. But modernity, as we now know fully well, is not the name of a single trajectory. Modernity itself is the name of multiple trajectories, multiple unique trajectories. Ours is one of them. So we need Indian political theory because there is a certain uniqueness to our experience. And every political theory in every part of the world must do justice to that uniqueness. There is a generality of our experience, but we would arrive at that generality only by recognizing that unique specificity of our experience. And for far too long, that unique specificity has been forgotten, denied, or not recognized. So we move on to the question of, do we already have a body of thought that can be called Indian political theory? It's an awkward question, given where I speak. But I must choose honesty over politeness. And the simple answer is no. We don't have that theory. Not in the academia. I do not mean to say that India has never had the tradition of political theorizing. I do not mean to say that India has not had great people who think about politics. All I'm saying is that what passes for political theory in India, Indian academia today, is not something that can or should be called Indian political theory. Why do I say so? I say so because India actually has had a very rich tradition of thinking about modern politics. And I'm not speaking of ancient India, I'm not speaking of medieval India, I'm just speaking of very modern India. For nearly 100 years, we have had one of the richest traditions of thinking about modern politics. This is modern Indian political thought. Call it the nationalist thought, call it by any name. So roughly from the middle of 19th century to roughly the middle of 20th century, we have had such a rich tradition of thinking. There was nothing, there was no major ideology in the world that was not reflected in India, that was not processed, that was not debated. And suddenly, something happens after independence, and that tradition suddenly dries up. Borrowing something for another scholar, I call it the sudden death of modern Indian political thought. Somewhere around 1960s, late 1960s, this great, vibrant tradition of thinking about politics suddenly dries up. So it's like a, you may have seen rivers when you create a dam. And it's always a exciting and tragic experience to drive along the river, which is flowing. Then comes a dam, lovely modern dam. Then you drive after and you suddenly feel, "Arey, kya ho gaya? There's no water." Something of that kind happened in India in 1960s, post-independence. I have written something about it, proposed to write more about it. But let's, for the time being, just call it the sudden death of modern Indian political thought. That is a moment when political theory makes a transition. Because all these great thinkers for those 100 years are activists. They are leaders. They are engaged in politics. These are practitioners of politics who are reflecting on politics. That tradition suddenly comes to an end. And the business and the job of theorizing about politics is given to university professors. And without beating about the bush, I would say that the transfer of the task of political theory from practitioners to university-based academics has been an unmitigated disaster for India. Suddenly, everything changes. Suddenly, our political theory is so weak, so emaciated, so completely dependent, and so completely cut off from the lived experience of politics. Sometimes I call it, since many of you are students of political science, I keep joking and saying, in my school in childhood, the word science, you would remember, you come from the same institution. The word science was called science. It's a very Punjabi way of saying the science. So, political science and political sense, which is to say political sense, have diverged in this country. There is a political science and academic discipline, and there is a sense of politics. And now that I have one foot in both the worlds, I can tell you there is actually very little connect between the two. Political science and political sense do not speak to each other. And the problem is not with political sense. The problem is those who claim to have a science of politics. That's where the real problem lies. There are all kinds of sociological reasons for that. There is disconnect of the academia from society. Suddenly these university-based academics come up. Universities have very little connect with the world outside, largely because of the language issues and all kinds of other issues. There is two things happen simultaneously. Those who are theorizing about politics, that is to say professors based in academia, are at the same time cut off from practice of politics and integrated with global academia. Both things happen at the same time. One disconnect and one connect. This changes the shape of political theory in India. In the 100 years of modern Indian political thought, right or wrong, political theory is responding to needs of political practice. They could be wrong. I mean, I'm not saying they were right. Some of them were completely wrong-headed. Some of them were advocating things that I would find obnoxious. But they were all responding to something that was happening in reality. They were engaged. They were aware of what was happening in the world. Most of them were aware. But they would receive it with a filter, which was their own filter, the filter of their own lived experience. What happens after 60s, in this shift from modern Indian political thought to the formal academic political theory, is that this to and fro with political practice on the ground is nearly gone. And the filter which enabled them to say, well, this may be the trendy thing in the West, but I won't take it. It makes little sense to me. That is gone. So what we then have is actually a word you would understand, which is a derivative discourse, which is to say, if something is being taught in Harvard or Columbia today, I more or less know after 10 years it will be taught in JNU. JNU से फिर वो दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी जाएगी, फिर वहाँ से कुरुक्षेत्र जाएगी, कुरुक्षेत्र से रोहतक आएगी, उसके बाद उचाना या हिसार में पहुँचेगी. I don't need to know what's actually happening in the society. So it's a certain trade of ideas. It's a certain import and it's a derivative relationship of ideas that begins. It has to do with caste profile and cultural background of our academia, which has been extremely lopsided. All these things put together, I don't want to do a detailed sociological analysis of why it went wrong. But what happened is that much of what passes for political theory in our country, and this I'm speaking of the mainstream stuff. I'll say something about the exceptions later. There are exceptions and I would say something about that. But what passes for political theory is actually 2 or 3 kinds of things. One is what my teacher, Professor Kaviraj, used to say. He made a nice Bengali distinction between theory kora or theory golpo kora. Doing theory and telling stories about theory. Golpo is not gup in Bengali. Golpo is story. So he used to say there's a distinction between doing theory and telling stories about theory. So when I write a brilliant article on Habermas, I'm not doing theory. Please don't mistake it. There's nothing theoretical about it. Habermas says this, Habermas thinks that, is no different from a shoemaker in Araria who thinks this, who thinks that. As an anthropologist, I can go and report all that. These are stories about, these are sophisticated theory. Habermas is clearly a far more sophisticated thinker. But reporting on what Habermas thinks is not a theoretical enterprise. You can say it's intellectual history of the present. So much of what is called political theory in our country is actually simply telling stories, sometimes coherent, sometimes not so coherent, stories about someone else's theory. And who are these someone else? These are the top names of whatever happens to be trendy and acceptable in Western academia at that particular point. For the last 40 years, I have seen this game. वहाँ कैसे कैसे फैशन बदलता है, यहाँ कैसे कैसे बदलता है. जो कपड़ों में होता है वही पॉलिटिकल थ्योरी में भी होता है. बहुत अलग नहीं है. वहाँ कपड़ों का फैशन बदलता है, यहाँ भी बदल जाता है. वहाँ पॉलिटिकल थ्योरी का फैशन बदलता है, यहाँ भी बदल जाता है. Like those clothes have nothing to do with our climate. Similarly, that theory has nothing to do with our political reality. Theory is also a lot of name dropping. I see that happening all the time. I wanted to say it. I'm sorry if it hurts. I see people coming from my town, Ganganagar, then they come to JNU, Then they pick a lingo, and that lingo is all about dropping names and impressing someone. I don't know who's being impressed. After some time, they also realize that one should be impressed if someone says Hegel, if someone says, whatever is the latest, Derrida or whatever. So it's a little game that we are playing with each other. We learn to drop those names, and we learn to be impressed if someone else drops those names. Does it improve our understanding? Does it enable us to see the world we live in with some clarity? I don't think we use that criteria anymore. So theory, that's what I call intellectual atyachar. It's not emotional atyachar, it's intellectual atyachar. Theory as big names, complex words, what I called politics till yesterday, I'll call the political. अरे तुम्हें the political नहीं पता? फिर बंदा घबरा जाता है, अच्छा the political नहीं पता, मुझे जाके सीखूंगा, वो सब कुछ करूंगा, So it's finding new words for something that everyone has known and used all this while. But just to impress, मैं तुमसे कुछ अलग हूँ, तुमसे कुछ ऊपर हूँ, तुम्हें इतना भी नहीं पता. So पहले मैं डरता हूँ, फिर मैं बाद में दूसरों को डराना शुरू कर देता हूँ. This is a standard psychological problem. But that's no theory. I mentioned examples of good theory. A good theory suddenly gives you a sense of, बत्ती खुल गई, बत्ती जल गई दिमाग की, एकदम समझ आने लग गया. That's what theory should do. It should not frighten you. If theory frightens you, something is wrong with that. Or theory as a language of power, which is to say, theory as Angrezi. So much of what passes for theory is just English and nothing else. You take English out of it, translate that into Bhojpuri, translate that into my Hindi, translate that into Telugu or Tamil, tell someone this is what's being said, he would say, अच्छा, ये सीखने के लिए तुम दिल्ली गए थे. So, it's just the power of English language, which masquerades as theory. Now, these, as I said, I did want to talk about these things, not because these are the best examples. There are exceptions. There are people who've done wonderful work. And this is not what every Indian political theorist falls in. But I did want to say that an overwhelming majority of what is called theory, our experience of doing theory, receiving theory, being frightened by it, etc., falls in one of these categories. Theory as story, theory as social capital, theory as language of power. Having said this, I must say there are very significant exceptions. JNU itself has led some of those exceptions. But I'm not happy even with those exceptions, because those exceptions, to my mind, fall in two categories. One is theory as critique. So, in a significant, I should say there are three categories. One is theory as application. Second is theory as critique. Third is theory as supplementation or amendment. In all these three, Western political theory of the day is the political theory. First type is I apply it to India. And as soon as we have applied it to India, we suddenly think we are doing theoretical work. So large number of theses in JNU. In my days, almost every thesis began by saying theories of Indian state. So Ralph Miliband, Polanza's and that kind of stuff, and then it'll go get. So applying Western theory to India is useful, interesting. It's useful and interesting only if it begins to tell us what's wrong with that original theory and why it cannot be applied. If we can fully apply it to India, then there's probably either we are dealing with a truly exceptional case, or we are completely wrong-headed about the way we are doing it. Second, we have examples of theory as critique, which is to say many scholars have offered understanding of, have picked up Western political theory and said, it does not apply in the case of India for the following reasons. This is critique. This is very valuable. But this is not Indian political theory yet. It begins the foundations of Indian political theory, but that's not Indian political theory. Or in some cases, theory as supplementation or amendments. I pick up a Western political theory tool and I say, in India, we need to modify it a bit. That's useful. So there are these exceptions. But the reason I'm not happy with those exceptions is, or let me put it this way, I think the theoretical labor of all these scholars in the recent past, and you would have noticed I carefully desist from naming anyone. I've realized over the years that naming people is one of the most stupid things you can do. Because after that, the entire discussion is only about those names and nothing else. So therefore, I'm avoiding it. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. But the theoretical labor of some of these exceptional scholars who have worked on Indian political theory have sought to apply received theory to India, critiqued its limitations, or extended it. To my mind, it has prepared the ground for political theory, but it is not yet Indian political theory. It's an important thing. It's a necessary step, but not sufficient. Which brings me to my fourth part. What's the way forward? What is to be done? इसमें भी गड़बड़ है, आप कह रहे हैं उसमें भी गड़बड़ है, करना क्या है भाई? To my mind, what is called for is nothing short of a massive shift in the way we teach, research, and do political theory. And I'm here basically to call for that. That's the reason I so happily accepted your invitation. That's the reason I insisted that I will speak on this topic and not on any other topic. Because honestly, I'm here with an admission. People of my generation are here. I can see Professor Maninder Thakur. I'm here to almost offer an apology on behalf of my generation. We people missed an opportunity. You should not do that. So that's why I'm here, because I see many prospective political theorists in this room. Please do not make the mistake that we did. You can do much better than we did. You can make a fresh start, instead of going through that entire journey. And maybe that journey was necessary. Maybe, things that I critique so harshly today, maybe one has to go through all that in order to reach where we've reached here. But today you should not make that mistake. What can be done? To my mind, here and now is the starting point. For any political theory anywhere in the world, here and now should be the starting point, which is not to say you should research on here and now. But here and now, Desha and Kala, that's Desh and Kala is here and now. No? Desh and Kala dictates our questions. What is it that we should be asking? What is it that we want to make sense of? The moment we lose here and now as the starting point, something goes wrong. And I think this is what went wrong for the last 50, 70, 60 years of political theory in India. It lost a sense. It's lost its anchoring in here and now. They started imagining that they were living somewhere else. That's a very harsh way of putting it. But intellectually, I very often I wish to say to my colleagues, कहाँ रहते हो? किस देश में रहते हो? Which is to say, placing India at the center of the enterprise of political theory. I mentioned something about my own intellectual journey. And when I had done a few years of political theory, teaching of political theory, and the standard stuff of teaching Western political thought, and all these things that any teacher does. At that point, UGC had formed a committee to think about how syllabi should be revised. I had a strange suggestion to make then, and I would like to reiterate that suggestion 40 years after it was made. Namely, political theory courses should be abolished from political science discipline. Which is not courses. The only course you should retain is history of political thought. History of political thought should be taught because that's a basic thing. When I say political theory courses should be abolished, I'm saying separate courses which detach theory from everything else should be abolished. And instead, there's a second part to the proposal. Instead, theory should be inserted in every single course. Study of Indian political science should begin by focusing on making sense of contemporary India. And every single course, whether it's on voting behavior or it's on international relations or it is on caste, should have a theory component built into it. What it would do is that it would end this practice of theory as an exalted and separate activity. Theory is almost an alienating kind of an activity. It would stop that. But you may or may not accept that particular suggestion, but you understand the spirit in which I'm making it. The idea is to put Indian political practice at the heart of study of political science. The difficulty is that the manner in which our courses and our research and everything is structured, we kind of mentally place ourselves in Europe, where India happens to be one of the countries we study. And we have 1 or 2 courses on Indian politics and so on and so forth. That needs to be radically altered, because that's not how American political science teaches about America. In America, they have, many of you have better experience, but everything American is theory, concepts, and so on. And then the rest of the world is in a dustbin called comparative politics. I don't resent it. I actually, because this is how, as long as they don't pretend it to be universal political science, that's all right. That's how they look at the world. We should not replicate them. Partly because it's not the best way of understanding politics. Partly because we are more constituted by external influences than US may be. But the idea of putting your own political experience at the center of your study of politics is a very natural idea. Why should we not do it? I've already said that this is not to claim a privilege for India over other countries, because this applies to every country. This is also not to claim any pristine purity for the Indian experience, because Indian politics, just to be clear, our political experience has 4 layers built into it all the time. One is a universal layer, because politics all over the world has some universal qualities. There's a contest for power, there is, there's something universal. Then there is something that we historically share with many other countries, many post-colonial countries, many capitalist countries. Then the third layer is things which are unique to India. And fourth layer is things which are unique to a region, which are called local. But it's silly to call Tamil Nadu local. It could be bigger than many nation states of the world. So they are regional. All these 4 layers are working all the time. I do not mean to say that the third layer, namely the layer of the nation state, has some privilege. No. I'm simply making a case that if we focus on our political practice here and now, and turn the entire theoretical enterprise in order to make sense of it. In other words, Indian experience should become the natural north of our theoretical compass. Again, a word I draw from Professor Kaviraj. It's a beautiful expression. He says, in European theory, Europe is the natural north of their theoretical compass. Whatever they do, होता है ना, compass को कैसे भी घुमा दो, घूम के झट से north पे आ जाएगी. That's how what we call political theory is built. Unstated way, Europe is the natural north which is built there. And I fully understand. I truly believe, I do not resent it, because I truly believe modern social theory, modern Western social theory, is one of the unique achievements of human beings. It's a great source of learning. The trouble is, if we start believing it's a sole source for my learning, Instead, and the charm of that theory is so much that there is a temptation to replicate, is to copy it, is to pick it up. What we need to do, and that to me, if you ask me, the real challenge, we need to do to India what European social theory has done to Europe. That is our central theoretical challenge. Instead of simply picking the output of European social and political theory, dragging it to India and make it, there are clouds. You want to carry those clouds and make them rain in India. Don't do that. We need that distillation of the European experience that European social theory has done. We need to do similar distillation of our political experience. That, to my mind, is our challenge. If this is called decolonization, so be it. I don't have any quarrel with that name, as long as it is not limited to picking holes in the received theory. As long as we are not simply, a bit of decolonization is to say, this is wrong with the West, this is wrong with the West. It's all right. There's a lot wrong with that. But what are you doing? I really want to focus on that bit. What would it mean? Enough of abstract talk. What would it mean in concrete terms? 1. Shift in the framing of our research questions and priorities. I keep saying, pick your answers from anywhere in the world, as long as the question is your own. The problem is that we begin with false questions. The problem in so much of what passes for political theory is that we have answers in search of a question. I know social capital is the answer, क्योंकि वो तो बताया है उन्होंने वहां से. Now, to which question in Etawah, UP is social capital the answer is my research question. Now that's a completely wrong-headed way of thinking about it. So the question should be mine. And the question should come from the real lived political reality. After that, if 3rd century China gives you answer, by all means, please go and learn from them. If you find answer in Arthashastra, get it. If you find answers in Karl Marx's Capital, get it. But the question should arise from our own lived experience. And I don't see that happening very often. And this will be my plea to all of you. The question should be your own. There is that little episode about legend. I think it's not an episode, it's a legend about Professor J.P.S. Oberoi in Delhi University. Some student approached him and said, "Sir, I want to do research with you." He said, "Fine, वैसे तबीयत तो ठीक है?" He said, "Yeah, ठीक है. नींद वींद आती है?" "हाँ, सब आती है." "तो भाग जाओ, तुम्हें रिसर्च करने की कोई ज़रूरत नहीं है." जब तक नींद ना आए, जब तक ऐसा कोई सवाल ना हो कि तुम्हें नींद ना आए रात को, तब तक रिसर्च मत करो. Now, that's a legend. I wish all of you very good sleep every day. But I think it captures a point. Is there something real that troubles us? Or are we searching for questions because we have to fill a few pages? Because our professor has asked us to do something? That's the first step towards creating an Indian political theory, is to get our real questions. And after that, search for answers anywhere in the world. Please do not allow the boundaries of nation state or boundaries of today or of university to decide to restrict your inquiry. Second, as I said, shift in the syllabi. I would really want that to happen. I have no hope of being able to do so. I really think the entire teaching of political science in India should be around Indian politics. Everything else should feed into that. Everything else should flow from that. All theoretical enterprise should be around that. Third, shift in the medium of thinking. Now we're used to medium of teaching, but we don't think hard about medium of thinking. I really think that one of the biggest problems of our political theory, and the reason why our political theory is so weak, so detached, is because of the dominance of English language. English language is one of the biggest curse when it comes to our political theory. Now, this might sound like a very odd, extreme statement, because so much of political theory is about learning English, you know. But just come to think of it, is it not an elementary thing that any understanding of politics must begin by understanding the understanding of those who participate in it? That's elementary. You know, in any social phenomena, we try to understand what that actor or subject is doing. Now, how many political actors in India think in English language? Maybe these days I find some of them, but maybe 0.01%. Why is it that our theoretical enterprise does not take place in the languages in which those people actually think? How can we circumvent it? Again, as I said, I'm interested in the medium of thinking. I'm not interested in the medium of writing. Write in English for all I care. You'll get degrees, you'll get quick degrees if you write in English. But how can we not think through that language? How can we produce books on Indian politics where not a single footnote is about anything to do with any Indian language? I can show you books, big books, famous books, which claim to understand Indian politics. Not one single footnote is from any Indian language. Can you imagine a British political theorist who wants to make sense of English politics, who says, well, I know England very well. The only problem is I don't know English language. Do you imagine something of that kind? Well, that would be very odd. Aisa nahi hoga. But I can tell you 9 out of 10 examples from India belong to that category. The question of language, and at the moment I'm not into the other question of language, of justice, injustice, and so on and so forth. I'm simply into the cognitive question. How can we not think through Indian languages? So, just as they do, you know, if you were to go abroad, if you wanted to do a PhD on China, the first thing they would say is go do a 6-month course on Mandarin. ना उसके बिना आपको कोई घास नहीं डालेगा. 2 मिनट के लिए कोई प्रोफेसर आपसे बात नहीं करेगा. Why can't we do that to all Indian students? You know, most of us have some access to one of the Indian languages. I would imagine 98% people sitting here would have access to one of the Indian language. Then we come to JNU. We try very hard to learn English. And we try equally hard to forget the language that we knew. All of us do that. कहीं गलती से ना निकल जाए उसे. As a result, we actually are disconnected from the subject that we want to understand. Would it not be a good idea to make it mandatory for every student of political science to learn one Indian language? And when I say Indian language, I obviously do not mean Hindi. It can be any language. And it need not be contemporary language. Get them to learn Sanskrit. How many political theorists in India know Sanskrit? Probably 2 or 3. Pali, not even one. I don't know if there's any, Maninder would tell me, but I don't know if a single political theorist who understands and reads Pali. Persian, Arabic, Classical Tamil? None. How many Western political theorists know Latin or Greek? Many. They are all taught. Isn't there something radically wrong with it? So that's a shift in the medium of thinking. Once again, I have no problem if you write your dissertation in English language. But how can you not go through the concepts that people have in their mind when they think about politics? And in order to understand, you have to go through their language, which is your own language. Fourth is a shift in our canon. For far too long, we have imagined that the canon of Western political thought is our canon. Yes, it is. We should unhesitatingly embrace everything in this universe. But that should not be at the cost of not building our own canon. We have done serious injustice to the intellectual traditions of this country. And if someone could give me that power, I would say for the next 20 years, just focus on this. Building our own canons, which is to say, paying attention to our multiple traditions of thought. Political thinking did not begin 20 years ago. Political thinking did not begin 70 years ago. There have been multiple traditions of thinking, some of high text, some oral. But developing those canons in different languages, at different points, and canons which have been eclipsed, those traditions of thought which have been forgotten, rebuilding them should be one of our principal enterprise. And fourth, and on a lighter note, I think there has to be a shift in the image of a political theorist. For far too long, political theorists are people who who come from Oxford or Cambridge, who speak English with an accent, and who say, oh my God, this is what's happening in India. I think of political theorists as a jholawala who's walking around, who keeps wondering why eastern part of Bhojpur in Uttar Pradesh and the western part of Bhojpur in Uttar Pradesh and the eastern part of Bhojpur in Bihar, why do they behave so differently in politics? The person who's constantly thinking about that, or who's thinking about the impact of Nagarjuna on the Kannada literary tradition. For me, these are the political theorists of India. The image has to change, but that's a lighter note. Specifically, you would recall I began by talking of 3 tasks for political theory. Where should we go? Where do we stand? How do we go from where we are to where do we stand? On these 3, I have some suggestions and thoughts. On normative, that is to say, where should we go? What's an ideal society? What's an ideal politics? I think the important thing is to be able to articulate a telos, articulate a utopia, articulate a vision, which is not simply re-traveling the path that Europe has taken. What amazes me is the intellectual timidity of modern Indians, whether it's in economics or in anything else. Somehow our highest ambition is to be able to copy the West properly, including our so-called nationalist prime minister. You know, what's the final dream? Bharat ek viksit desh banega. अरे बाबा 60 साल पुरानी वोकेबुलरी है, थोड़ा नई वोकेबुलरी ले आते. The idea of a developed nation. Is that the ultimate that, so basically the idea is that we should be able to somehow relive the experience of Europe for a certain centuries. Is that all that we are condemned to doing? Is there no higher or different ideal that we can aspire to? To my mind, the principal task of political theory is to articulate what I call Swadharma of India. That's my language. Not everyone needs to accept it. That's my obsession almost. Which is to say, what is the ideal? What are the norms implicit in our political practice, which can be explicated and stated as an ideal? What do we do for that? One would be paying careful attention to pre-modern traditions of thinking. I think we've just not, while none of us blinks an eye when we are taught Plato or Aristotle, which should be taught, but somehow we don't believe that, we don't worry about the fact that actually the connection of modern Europe and modern West to that Greek or Roman legacy is absolutely fraudulent. There's no connect between the two. They have invented this connection, and they have sort of illegitimately captured that past, which doesn't belong to Europe, actually a European civilizational legacy. But we are unable to and unwilling to explore something in our own past. And when I say past, pre-modern traditions, I do not limit it only to Sanskrit or to Vedas. Our Buddhist tradition, Sufis, I've been reading Muzaffar Alam of late, and it's so stunning as to how they encounter this problem of what kind of polity do you structure in a country where Islam is not the dominant religion, and how they actually change their practices in order to make that adjustment, and how they change it theoretically. Why do we not think about those things? Or there is a long tradition of pre-colonial Christianity in India, to which we pay almost no attention. Everyone in this country somehow has started believing that Christianity came to India along with the British colonial rule, which is simply not true. But we have no attention on that issue. So to my mind, in order to articulate that normative vision, we need to pay much greater attention to pre-modern intellectual traditions than we have. We need to pay attention in the 20th century to an almost lost tradition. Because for some reason, some aspects of our 20th century intellectual legacy of modern Indian political thought have become very well known. The left tradition being one of them, Gandhi being one of them, Nehru being one of them, Dr. Ambedkar now being one of them. But some aspects of that tradition have been simply lost. One of which is what I call the Swaraj tradition. Look at someone like K.C. Bhattacharya, look at Vinoba Bhave, someone I didn't think much of, I must confess with shamefacedly. I didn't think anything of Vinoba Bhave because, he supported emergency in my eyes, and that was the end of my dealing with Vinoba Bhave. But over the recent years, I've started reading Vinoba Bhave, and what an extraordinary thinker he is. Perhaps better scholar than most of our university professors, but also someone who's an extraordinary thinker, to which we pay no attention. A.K. Saran, the entire Jaipur school with Krishna and so on. I've been of late trying to read Nirmal Verma, his Hindi essays, and what this. So there's a long tradition of which someone like Ashish Nandi becomes a superstar. But that's a long tradition that is waiting to be recovered. And I should also, given my own partisan inclination, mention the Indian socialist tradition. While the Indian Marxist tradition got a lot of academic attention, Indian socialist tradition, which to my mind was far more original than the formal orthodox left tradition of India, has received very little theoretical attention. Someone like Acharya Narendra Dev, who said he was a Marxist till the end of his life, but was the most renowned scholar of Buddhism. Why do we not study Acharya Narendra Dev's interpretation of Buddhism? And it never ceases to amaze me that this entire academia has learned Orientalism, has learned Edward Said, has learned post-colonial language, and does not have 1 minute to spare for the Indian thinker who actually started it all, namely Ram Manohar Lohia. Lohia's critique of Eurocentrism, which begins in the 1940s, anticipates and in many ways is far ahead of post-colonial theorization that came much later. But we paid almost no attention to him. So these are, to my mind, the kind of traditions that need to be recovered in the normative side. The second aspect I said was explanatory causal political theory, where, to my mind, our central challenge is to draw concepts from everyday life and to build it into our explanatory frameworks. Koselleck, this German thinker, has a whole encyclopedia of words and how those words have changed their meaning over the years. I keep discussing that with Vivek. But we need to do something of that kind for India. The word Janata or the word public as it is used in India, I almost sometimes suggest that we should use this word with a K to distinguish it from the English word public. The word public has very different meaning in Indian languages. Recently, Partha Chatterjee has, in his book, has done something truly astonishing. He has looked at the word nation across at least 10 Indian languages and how the Rajya, Desha, Desham, how they evoke very different normative universe. How their notion of what a nation is very, very different in each language. I disagree with his conclusions on this point. But to my mind, that is the starting point of political theory. You go and ask, okay, what does India? Acha, India is Desham. What is Desham? What does it mean? What does it sound to you like? That has to be the starting point of political theory. So that to me is or the concept of Hawa that I talk about very often in elections. These are the kind of things that we need to think about when we come to explanatory framework. And just to rush through the last one on prescriptions, what is to be done? Something that we have almost forgotten now to be a part of political theory, because this is done by politicians. But please remember, 100 years ago, this used to be a central part of political theory. What is to be done was taught in political science courses and should be taught. So the whole in the Marxist tradition, there was a very important part of it which said a significant part of your theoretical task is to identify those forces of change. It could be this class or that class or whatever. That task has simply been abandoned by everyone. That part of the Marxist theory needs to be brought in. And if someone were to ask, okay, so here we face a certain situation in our country, who are the agents of change? How would change come about? One more funny thing which you would not expect me to say, but I find it interesting. Over the last 10 or 15 years, electoral consultants have now come in India, symbolized by PK, who's become very famous. I have looked at this business with considerable disdain. And I have always said that the coming of these electoral consultants is a sign of decline of politics. But when I meet some of these people, as I'm forced to, because they think they have something to teach me or to talk to me about, I have been astonished by how much attention and what kind of nuanced thinking that goes into what is to be done. Political theorists should learn from it. Never say no to learning from whichever source it comes to, even if it's consultants who are making lakhs of rupees for every election. To listen over the last 20, 30 years. But today I feel a certain sense of urgency, because what we face today is nothing short of dismantling of our democratic republic, which is happening right in front of our eyes. Dismantling of institutions, dismantling of practices, and basically also dismantling of our constitution. And as it happens all over the world, in 21st century style, democracy is destroyed in the name of people. You know, that's the 21st century style or format of it, which is exactly what's happening in our country. How does it relate to the enterprise that I've been talking about? Because I think it strikes me very deeply every time it hits me that we, and by we I do not mean we the socialists or we the leftists, no. All those who believe in that constitutional vision of India, we have lost a political battle. We have also lost a cultural and intellectual battle. Winning political battle back is not the job of political theory. I would not burden political theorists with that. But winning that cultural and intellectual battle is our responsibility. We have lost this country's rationale to a set of goons. Frankly, today we do not have conceptual resources, while all of us, me and my friends, continue to speak as if everything is correct with us, and those who happen to be in power are wrong on all counts, which is usually how we think about politics. As you probably know, I feel passionately about these things. I make no bones about the fact that I stand in opposition to the present dispensation. And the opposition is not light, it's deepest possible opposition, because to my mind, the present dispensation in this country stands against everything that is the idea of India, or what I call the Swadharma of India. What we are witnessing is an assault on the Swadharma of India. But we do not have moral resources. When this lecture would be put on the YouTube, Yogendra Yadav spoke in JNU. All you need to do is to read the first 15 comments on that YouTube. Yogendra Yadav, JNU, are ye to hona hi tha. So without, they would have no idea that what I'm speaking to you. In fact, half of them would be stunned, surprised, and would be astonished to hear this is what I was saying. But we lose a moral battle before it begins. These people, what do they know of India? What do they know of Indian culture? What do they know of these things? जी वो शुरू हो चुका होगा already, अगर कोई दिखा रहा है. There's a certain, so what we face is moral illegitimacy. Those who are carriers of this country are assumed to be morally illegitimate. What we face is analytical or explanatory bewilderment. क्या हो रहा है, कैसे हो रहा है, हर रोज, every morning we are surprised. And what we face is political helplessness. क्या कर सकते हैं, कुछ तो नहीं कर सकते. This is where political theory comes in. Please remember, and that's why I'm here to speak to you. Political theory flourishes at the time of crisis. It is only when things go so bad that fresh and original thinking takes place. Unlike people of my generation, you have a great opportunity. You are not burdened by having done something for 30 years or not having done something for 40 years, like people like me are. You can make a fresh start. This is a great opportunity, to my mind, if we want to respond to this sense of moral illegitimacy, causal bewilderment, and sense of political helplessness. It must begin by taking control, a theoretical control, and making sense of Indian politics. Sitting in this room, you cannot change Indian politics, but you can understand it. You can make sense of it with new tools, with new ways, in a new language. Decolonization of political theory is not an intellectual luxury. It is a political necessity of our times. Recovery of Indian political theory, therefore, is a step towards reclaiming our republic. It is this political necessity that brought me here, and I'm very grateful that all of you heard me. Thank you very much.